Hi, everybody. Welcome to another episode of The Lowdown by Analysis.tech. I am your host today. I'm John Rymer, one of the principals at Analysis.tech, and I am joined by my colleague, partner, friend, and Analysis.tech's data guy, Rick Greenwald. Rick, welcome. Great to be here
Hi,
with you.
hi, John. Thanks. It's great to be here. And it's great to talk about, as you know, one of my favorite topics, which I don't get to talk about in the line at the supermarket that often, which is data.
Okay, so what we're going to do here, folks, today is Rick, as our data guy, is diving into lots of topics that address data and its management and its governance. So this is probably the first of a series. And Rick, we're going to start today with a really simple question that's been with us for a long, long time. Do you have too much data? Do you have more data than you need? Are you storing too much data? We've been wrestling with this forever. What's the answer, Rick? What's the quick answer?
Probably not. There's a bunch of reasons for this. Well, people think they have too much data for a very simple, because they look at it in a very simplistic way. Look and say, wait a second, I've got a gazillion gigabytes of data. That's got to be too much. I have too much data. Then they immediately jump to the next thing, which is, you know what? We have a lot of duplicate data, people copying data over. So we're wasting a lot of space and we don't need this much. Let's get rid of the data that we don't need. Well, there's a
Isn't,
lot of go ahead.
isn't there a lot of duplicate data?
No, let's talk about that. Let's talk about that though, because people talk about duplicate data, and what they always say is, this guy here needs to run a report, so he copies the data over here, and this guy needs to run a report, he copies it over there. Blah, 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 blah. This is duplicate data. We're going to compress it down. We're going to have one single source of the truth. My least favorite phrase in the whole world of data, which we'll get to later. And we're going to reduce the amount of data we have. Well, first of all, before we go anywhere, let's just talk about what does it cost you to keep more data? And the answer is almost nothing. 50 years ago, when magnetic disks were expensive, that might have been true, but we haven't been in that era. It's been cheap for a long time, and on the cloud, it's almost zero cost, okay? There's not a big deal to it. Right? And let's talk about that idea of duplicate data. And believe me, I worked at Gartner for 10 years. I get this question all the time. I have many copies of data. And I would always start with the same question. So when you say copy, do you mean bit for bit copy? You mean it's exactly the same? If I did a diff on these two files, they come out exactly the same. They go, well, no. Say, okay, so first of all, it's not a copy. If it's a copy, it means it's exactly the same. And that's almost never the case, because let's go back to how this started. Let's take the most egregious offender, the guy who copies the data. We're not even going to talk about different organizations or different departments. The guy who copies the data. What does he do? He copies the data to another copy of that data. He maybe puts it into Excel. And then what does he do? He massages that data. He changes it. He governs it according to the context of his use case. I'm going to talk about this again and again here. Context of the use case. And that the context of the use case shapes what it means for that data to be correct. So if he go ahead.
I love the example I've heard you give about prices.
It's worse than that. I'll talk about prices. What could be simpler? Here's the price. Okay, but hang on a second. That's the price. That's the unit price. Well, this guy over here says, I'm going to give you a discount based on the total amount of your order in this order. So now the price is different. This guy here says, I'm going to give you a discount based on the total amount you buy for the whole year. This guy here, right, says, I'm going to give you a discount based on what you order in the next hour. So even something like price is not the same. And the example I love to use for context is people say, well, it has the same context. Okay, let's talk about a single source of truth. The primary example of a single source of truth is a number, right? 1 is smaller than 2, unless you're talking about 1 gallon and 2 pints. It's no longer smaller. You laugh like this is simplistic, but this is actually true. This is the real world with context. So what we're talking about is not copies of data. What we're talking about is versions of data. And those versions of data stem from the same source. That is true. You don't want to delete that source. Good idea. But then it takes on a life of its own with this different version, shaped by the context and governed by the context that it's used in. So it's not the same data.
Not a copy.
And every time someone comes up with a new use case, it may or it may not have the same context. And usually it's not. Okay. So this idea that someone typically higher up in the structure, just looking at things like numbers of the amount of storage you have, says, this is way too much. We don't need all this. Well, yeah, you do. Because user A, if they use the data, use case A has context surrounding their data. And use case B has different context. And if use case B uses the data with the context of use case A, there's a word for what that data is, and it's called raw. Okay? It's inaccurate. And by the way, I don't want to go too far on this because Lord knows people don't properly govern their data all the time. This is why I call developers the dark side. Okay? They are frequently unaware of nuances like keeping the data correct. So I'm happy to say, no, you don't necessarily need the absolutely correct data in order to run an application or to have a successful system, even in order to have an enterprise system run successfully. But you better realize that's true, and you better compensate for it appropriately. It was a great quote. I mean, I love it when I hear users say the things that I've been telling them for years, and they admit to it. I was at a Zoho conference, and they had someone up there who had been developing stuff on the Zoho platform for 10 years. Great success story, or started as basically an admin, and started to play around and got good at this. Now she's in charge of developing IT applications across a very broad company. And they asked all the participants the question, what do you wish you knew when you started? She said, how complex data is. And I went up and talked to her. What I said is exactly what she said. Because this is real. You can develop your app without understanding that or knowing that or paying attention to it, but it will come back and bite you in the butt at an
Yeah.
unexpected.
Yeah. Hey, Rick, let's take a quick commercial break. If you're with us still on this podcast, thank you for joining us. We're grateful for your interest in these conversations. We produce them on this podcast just about every week. Analysis.tech is the producer here. We are a strategy advisory firm, and myself and Rick are both principals in this firm. We also have our colleagues, Rob Koplowitz, who is a process maven. We have Francis Carden, the father of robotic process automation, Dave Marcus, who is a whiz about channel marketing and channel relationships, as well as product strategy, and Andy Bartels, our economist. You can engage with us by contacting us at analysis.tech. And with that, Rick, let's move on. So I think what you're telling us is we're stuck with growing amounts of data, and that's just the way the world works.
Yeah, there's even more bad news. And then I'll get some good news, okay?
Please.
More bad news is that's not gonna change, okay? Yeah, I'm talking about this thing context. It's a neutral sounding word. It sounds harmless, but context represents the business conditions that your app is trying to address. Full stop, period. Is that important? Yeah. Does that change? All the time. When that changes, do we have to change the data? Frequently you do, okay? So this is why I hate this phrase, single source of truth. The beatings will continue until morale improves, you know? We're only gonna have one source of truth, but you don't have one use case, all right? And truth only has meaning within the context of the use case. And when you have lots of different use cases and lots of different moving parts, it's going to continue to change. So your data will continue to change. And the idea of saying, maybe I make this another version instead of trying to fix it back where it was because that's no longer relevant, that's actually a good idea. Because remember, storage is cheap. And when we're talking about is your data correct or not, this is make it or break it. Okay. I mean, if you're running systems on incorrect data, look, you can reach a good decision with bad data and a bad decision with good data, but you want the data to be correct. Sometimes I talk to people who didn't seem to care about governance at all, and I'd say, if you really want to save money, random number generators are really cheap. You want this stuff to be correct. However, I think there's a way out of this, and I've been writing about this lately, and I've been watching the market very carefully for this too. The problem is not too much data, because people are right when they say, we've got heterogeneous data all over the place. I don't know what to do with it. It's confusing. It's undercutting what I'm trying to accomplish. It's taking too long. Yes, understood. But what you want to do is not force all that data into a single source of truth, into a single value. What you want to do is manage those different versions better. Okay. And this is something where catalogs and repositories are coming into play. And they are going to help you. And by the way, John and I were talking over the podcast about AI. And I was saying, I kind of hate AI. I hate talking about it. Things like semantic search, when we're looking at multiple different versions of data and you can tag stuff and identify it yourself, it's going to be really, really useful. So the idea of having fewer versions of data is a fantasy. And what I always say is, the bad news is it's going to take you a long time. The good news is it's not going to work. So, I mean, take your choice.
I'm really, really glad you said good news because we really need some at some point, Rick. Are you going to give us any good news?
Well, yeah, the repository is going to help you manage this stuff. And not only will it help you find the data you want, it'll help you. You can have versions, and you can see as you change governance in one thing, you can see, will that ripple down across so I don't have to do it everywhere? You can do impact analysis. So, really, the idea is not that you have too much data. The idea is that you can't find the data you want. And you know what was invented to help people with problems like this? The database management system. That's the whole point of it. Okay. So now you can use a DBMS repository to handle metadata, to handle what that data is about. So rather than trying to beat the data into a smaller shape, find a way to manage it better. And by the way, I was at Google Next 2 weeks ago, and they just introduced something called a knowledge catalog, which is doing all this and more. I mean, it's early days, okay? People are starting to realize this. So I guess what I would say to people who come away from this, if you believe me, depressed about the amount of data, I say, stop thinking about the amount of data, start thinking about using that data effectively. Okay? Because that's possible.
So, Rick, database management systems have been around a long time. Do you find that people just underutilize the catalog and metadata management features of those products?
Well, keep in mind, there's a catalog in a database. It's a system catalog. It identifies structures and stuff. So it does things at a fairly rudimentary level. I mean, it's kind of like storage. You're storing stuff in storage blocks, and there's a format to that. But the idea of having extended metadata, that's kind of new. And there have been repositories on the market for a long time. I mean, Databricks has had the Unity catalog out for about 5 years now. And there have been companies like Calibra, which have catalogs. I'm pretty sure Calibra does that, but have had catalogs out there for a long time. But people haven't been looking at them because keep in mind, there's something else here to talk about in terms of context and scope. If I'm using one set of data and that's all I'm using, what does a catalog do for you? Nothing. You have a small amount of data, you have a small structure, you know what it is. When you're talking about combining data from multiple sources, unlocking new value by combining data, taking a broader view, at that point, the catalog becomes absolutely critical. And the problem is that most people have tunnel vision focusing on the exact tasks they're going to do. And I said something mean about developers earlier. So let me try and mediate that a little bit. Developers have a job to do, a task to do, and they have an amount of data that they use as building blocks for their system. And do they care about someone else's building blocks? No. But organizations should do that. And that's one of the problems because this is kind of a layer up in the organization where individuals are doing things which don't necessarily help them at all, but they help the organization immensely. And it's just hard for people to say, I'm going to care about something I'm not going to necessarily get an immediate payback from because it's going to be good for my organization. And that is as someone said the other day, we have to wait for humans to stop being human. for that to be second nature.
Well, that's going to be a long wait.
Yeah,
Rick,
no, baby steps, baby steps.
Rick, thank you. You've outlined this clearly. I want to highlight for people listening or watching that Rick covers this central question as well as others in a report that he has published, piece of analysis that he has published at analysis.tech, and it is called Data, Use Case Governance, and the Battle Against a Single Source of Truth. It's a good fight. So that is available for the cost of giving us your email on analysis.tech/research. So go and check it out. There's more there. And Rick, thank you for sharing your perspective and your knowledge and your experience. And we will look forward to the next podcast from our data guy at Analysis.
Oh, there's a lot more.